Hey students, this is your Professor Emilianchuk, and today I want to talk about how to translate into FOPL. So the last lecture was very long and dense, I realize, and that's just a function of trying to get everything into this course in the limited time that we have. But basically, one of the things that I wanted to do in this last lecture, basically, and then it's just review from here on out, is just instruct you on how to translate into FOPL and think hard about a sentence's parts. Right, so that's going to be what I want you to take away from this course is just how to think about a sentence's parts and basically have an understanding of the basic interpretations of first order predicate logic. Right, so basic interpretations. Okay, uh, you should really kind of become familiar with this fourfold pattern that you see in FOPL a lot. We already saw it last lecture with Aristotle's four categorical propositions. There's actually simpler expressions than Aristotle's, of course. It's usually how it usually goes with Aristotle. He likes to make things more complicated. But you do see this kind of everything, something, nothing, something is not type of pattern. Okay, so in this case, we're talking about all the composers in the world, and then our predicate is those who wrote concertos. Right, so when you have something that you see like this, for every x, x is C, or all the x's are in C. So everything is C, right? And given what we've kind of stipulated here, this says that every composer wrote concertos, right? Some x, right, is C, right? There is some x such that x is C, or something is C. Well, that means then some composer wrote a concerto, or at least one wrote concertos, okay? Or yeah, that's the predicate, wrote concertos, not wrote a concerto. Okay, and then you have something like this. For all the x's, it's not the case that x is in C. So nothing is in C, or every composer did not write concertos. Or you could say no composer wrote concertos, right? And then lastly, here you have there is some x such that x is not in C. So something is not C. So some composer did not write concertos, or at least one composer did not write concertos, right? So that everything, something, nothing, something is not style of thinking, right, is very much a part of this language, right? That's kind of four different categories. Right, and just to review Aristotle's categorical propositions, you had things said in terms of a universal affirmation, right? All F's are G's, so you have to have, this arrow formula relating the F's and the G's together with a universal quantifier. By contrast, the particular negation is just about, well, at least one thing, and so we use an existential quantifier to say something like some F is not G, right? Going back to the universal, right, we use the universal quantifier, and now we're using the arrow formula again, right? And this is a universal negation, okay? So that for every x, if x is an F, then it's not in G, meaning no F is G, right? And then the particular affirmation, some F is G, which is just in the FOPL speak, there is some x such that x is an F and x is in G. Right? And I told you to memorize those, it's a good idea. Right, and so you might have been wondering last lecture, why is it that, the statement in number 1 there uses an arrow, and then 2 uses an ampersand? Okay, and the answer has to do with the scope of inclusion. Okay, so if you look at the first one, right, what this is saying is that everything in the category of F is included in the category of G. So therefore, if x is in F, then x is in G. So you can see the big if and the big then there, I hope. And you can see that that is definitely a conditional. Okay, that's a conditional. Right? By contrast, in number 2, what we're doing there is picking out, or only picking out, at least one thing that is both F and G. Both F and G. So that both and in the capital letters there definitely signifies a conjunction, right? So it's just a matter of thinking about it. That's why we do this, okay? That's why we do this. We specify this stuff, right? And we just kind of think it through, and those are the connectives that map on, right? Okay, so One more thing is, just revisit this, right? Remember when you're working through your translation ideas, is just to pay attention to the order of the quantifiers, because the outermost quantifier is what gets mentioned first, right? So here's the outermost quantifier. That's definitely an existential. So some X, right, loves all the Y's. So that's nice and straightforward, right? That's your nice kind of left to right type of reading that we're used to in English, right? Everyone loves someone. Okay, that all makes sense. But then when you get to these, it's weird. Now you have to kind of like start on this side, right? You take stock of the fact that this is being mentioned first, but the Y is coming second, right, after the predicate. So you have to mention that first. Someone is loved by all the X's, right? So someone is loved by all, and that's a there you're mentioning the object first rather than the subject in the sentence, right? If you remember that from grammar school, the object is what receives the action, the subject is what performs the action. Okay, same thing here. All of the Y's are L'd by some X, so all are loved by someone. Okay, so just be mindful of that. When you're translating, you have to pay attention to how, what quantifier is being mentioned first. Okay, or whether or not in English the object's being mentioned first. That's what will change how you do your translations. Okay, just to remember from the first part of the course, you were translating things into TFL, meaning you were trying to use your truth functional connectives and correlating them with certain English expressions. So I just bring this back up to refresh your memory about how these things work, right? How conjunctions can be phrased a different way. Especially pay attention to how conditionals can be phrased a certain way, right? There's the inclusive and exclusive understandings of or and unless, right? And the different ways that you can translate an exclusive or, right? So when you're translating, it's best when you're practicing to work through these things and try to go from FOPL to English first, right? And this is pretty easy, okay? Because what you do is you just kind of think of the sentence as parts. And what I like to do always is just kind of zero in on the main connective, which is a biconditional. And biconditionals are easily translated. You just put if and only if, so that you know there's going to be two sides to that. And so we'll just leave the two sides alone at this point. Just get the main connective there, right? Figure out what type of sentence it is to begin with. Because if you get that wrong, well, then the whole thing is totally wrong, all right? Alright, so that first side of the biconditional looks oddly familiar, right? And I hope that you can remember this, right? That is looking like a universal affirmation. Now, instead of using F and G, we're using D and C. So what we can say is that all the D's are C's if and only if, and then we got to figure out what the second part of the biconditional says, right? So let's look at that. Right, so notice that it's a conjunction, right? So we might as well just put that, on the paper. Maybe not directly in the translating sentence, but in your marginalia. And then you can start kind of translating things. Now, you notice that it's got some variables in it, and what you have is an existential quantifier ranging over those variables. So let's just talk about that. If and only if there is some X such that, and then we're going to fill in our predicates on either side of the conjunction. So one side of the conjunction is really simple, right? X is C. So let's just put that on there. Okay, so there we got that. And that is on the right side of the conjunction. And now we got to fill in the left side. And if we look at the relational predicate, what that's saying is that X is bearing B to B, right? So that is the translation. All D's are C's if and only if there is some X such that X bears B to B and X is C. Now that sounds totally ridiculous. I realize that, okay? My response is to just say, though, who cares? That is logically correct. And that's all we care about in this class when we're translating, is getting things logically correct. The real art of translation is kind of making things elegant and sound, and making things sound nice in the target language. So you take what's the content of the original language and you make it sound intelligible and, if not elegant and beautiful, in the target language. But in logic, just embrace the clunkiness, right? This was good advice I got from a Latin teacher, believe it or not. I was trying to translate things from Latin into English. And my English sentences, translations that were always so clunky because I was always really obeying strictly the grammar of the sentence. And I always kind of felt bad about my translations because they just sounded so terrible. But the teacher thought he just didn't care about that. He wanted me to get the grammar and the logic correct, and that's exactly what I want you to do too. Okay, so I don't care if you don't have a nice sounding sentence here. I just want you to get the logic right. So going from English to FOPL is much more difficult, and that's kind of what we're going to be testing you on the final exam, and also the homework, right? The reason you should go from FOPL to English first is you can kind of get a sense of how things work. And so then when you go from English to FOPL, you'll be able to kind of see what to do, right? So the basic thing you have to understand here is that you need a consistent way to assign predicates and names, okay? You absolutely have to be consistent. Now the problems in the final will specify what the names and predicates are, okay? So let's look at a sentence. If some city has lower taxes than Indianapolis, then Kansas City is in between Los Angeles and Boston. So what you gotta do first is find your names. Okay, so you have Indianapolis, Kansas City, Los Angeles, Boston, right? Then find your predicates. Okay, we have two of them. We have lower taxes than, so we're gonna use the capital L. And we have the between predicate, so we'll use capital B for that. Okay, then try to figure out what your truth functional connectives are. All right, so in this case, right, we have an if-then. All right, and you can kind of see that with this whole sentence, the type of sentence it is, it's a conditional. So we need to represent that. Be warned though that this and right here between Los Angeles and Boston, that is not a truth functional connective. Okay, now that's really weird. You might be thinking, well, no, that's a conjunction. I need to put an ampersand there. Okay, the problem with doing that though is we go back a couple slides here. Notice that and is part of the is between predicate. So it's, the between predicate is basically saying X is in between Y and Z. Right, so you need to remember, sometimes this happens, okay, so you really need to pay attention to that, okay? Right, then find your quantifiers, okay, and then note what they quantify over in the domain of discourse. So in our case, what we're talking about are cities, right? The domain of discourse is obviously metropolitan areas, which we call cities here in the US, all right, and so what we're going to do then is just let the variables stand in for cities. We don't have to come up with a predicate, right, for city. That doesn't matter, right? So when we're translating, when it's all said and done, it's going to look like this. There is some X such that X has lower taxes than I, only if, or you could say if then, right? Let's actually start it that way, right? If there is some X such that X has lower taxes than I, then K is in between L and B, okay? That is how it is translated. All right, let's look at this one. Every city with friendly neighborhoods is larger than Eastover or Indianapolis. Okay, find your names. Okay, there they are. Find your predicates. Right, there it is, right? Find your truth functional connective. Okay, it's or. Warning, however, or is not the main connective of this sentence. Okay, it's not. And you might be thinking, well, what could it be if it's not or? I mean, I see it right there before my eyes in English. Right, well, what I want you to do is think about the sentence, right? And think about Aristotle's 4 propositions, right? And is it a particular negation? Is it a universal negation? Is it a particular affirmation? Or is it a universal affirmation? Okay, and that should have given you a hint, right? This is a universal affirmation. This is an all F's or G's style statement, okay? So what this actually is a kind of conditional, okay? So what you're gonna do when you're translating is, right, and it's a quantified statement, I realize, okay? Because it has a quantifier governing how we think about it, right? But this is the form of it, okay? There's the translation, and what this is saying is that for every x, if x is f, meaning if the city has a friendly neighborhood, then, right, the city is going to be larger than Eastover or larger than Indianapolis, right? And so that is a universal affirmation. Now, what's interesting about the universal affirmation here is the consequent. That's where your disjunction is found, okay? I also want you to note in that consequent, there are two instances of the larger than predicate. Now that seems kind of weird because larger than is only mentioned once in English. Yes, true, but it's being used twice, right? It's being attributed twice, right, to Eastover and Indianapolis. Okay, so that's why we have to use it and mention it twice in FOPL. So this use mention distinction, right, is really important to understand. Right, here's another example. No city with public parks has lower taxes than every city with dog parks. All right, so I've got my predicates and I'll figure it out. I don't even have any names at all here. I just have predicates. And so now I'm just talking about cities. And so basically what we're going to be doing here is just attaching variables to predicates. And I notice here that I have two different quantifiers. I have no city and every city. Okay, and so you might be thinking, okay, given the way this thing is stated, what sort of proposition is it? Think back to Aristotle's four propositions, right? Is it a universal affirmation, particular negation, universal negation, or a particular affirmation? And the form of it is actually a universal negation. There's the translation, okay? Or that's the style of the translation. Remember, no f is g, which has that form of for every x, if x is f, then x is not in g. Okay, so it is going to look like that. But you have to remember there are two quantifiers here, okay? So we need to kind of make sense of what's going on here. So one of them is the universal negation, and the other one is going to be in the consequent of that FOPL sentence that represents the universal negation. All right, so let's just kind of break it down piece by piece. Let's go with the first part of it. So no city with public parks. So what this is going to say is that for every x, if x has public parks, then, and then we put the tilde on the outside, okay? And now we're going to put everything inside the parentheses that we haven't translated that. So that's going to be x has lower taxes than every y with dog parks. So now we just got to translate this part, right? X has lower y than every y with dog parks. Here's how it looks, all right? So what you do, all right, is you now have this negation negating a quantified sentence, right, that is talking about all of the y's that have dog parks. And this word with here, that is signifying a conjunction, right? Because what's happening here is we're talking about, right, the cities that have public parks having lower taxes than every city with dog parks. Now, what this is basically saying is that for all the x's, if x has public parks, right, it is not the case that the public park cities are larger than those that have dog parks. All right, so no city with public parks has lower taxes than every city with dog parks. Right? That's a way of expressing that logic. Perhaps a more intuitive way of doing that would be to do this. This is another way of saying this. You could say there is no x such that x has public parks and x is larger than every city with public parks. Right, so sometimes you have to, the main theme of this here is you kind of have to figure out, okay, what type of proposition is this? But then you kind of have to start kind of filling in the blanks a bit. And, okay, because your consequent might be really complicated, and then you got to figure that out. The antecedent might be complicated, you got to figure that out. But what you do is you just think about the sentence's parts, and you break them down bit by bit and put it together. All right, so here is the practice section. All right, on the next slide are the answers, so you can check those against your work. There they are, right? But work on those and try to do the best you can, and really get to know those 4 propositions by Aristotle, and you'll be all right. So if you have any questions, just shoot me an email, and I will talk to you later.